The sky boiled like a cauldron above the endless stretch of desert plains, swollen clouds smearing the horizon with bruised purples and bleeding reds. The air carried that strange, electric stillness that comes before disaster. A warning whispered across the dry grasses and brittle mesquite trees. Matthew Callahan, once the son of a proud rancher, now the barely breathing caretaker of 20 dying acres, sat slumped in the saddle, watching the coming storm swallow the world one dark gulp at a time. He should have turned back an hour. Should have gone home, bolted his doors, and prayed the walls would hold. But the drought had left him no choice. His cattle were dropping in the fields like flies, and unless he found the stray he'd been tracking, his last strong bull, the bank would own his ranch by winter. So he pressed on, leaning low over his horse's neck, squinting through the blowing dust that already stung his eyes like ground glass. Then he heard it, faint at first, almost lost beneath the wind's rising howl. A cry, a human cry. Matthew froze in his saddle. It was too far out here for settlers, and any ranch hand worth a damn would have already taken shelter. Only a fool, or someone dying, would be caught in this storm. He kicked his horse forward, heart pounding hard enough to drown the wind, following the sound as it rose and broke and fell again. Minutes later he came over a low ridge and stopped dead. Down below, in the shallow cut of a dry creek bed, two figures were lashed upright against the splintered remains of a wagon wheel. They were motionless, but for the violent tug of the wind, tearing at their long black hair. Their ankles were bound, their wrists tied above their heads, raw from rope burns. Two women. Matthew slid off his horse, boots sinking into the soft dust as he stumbled toward them. They were enormous, not just tall, but powerfully built. Their shoulders broad, arms corded with muscle, faces striking and proud even beneath the layers of dirt and blood. Apache. There was no mistaking it, from the beaded necklaces hanging around their necks to the sun-faded dresses half torn from their backs. Everything about them screamed they were daughters of the desert tribes, and someone had meant them to die. Here. The choice Matthew's hand hovered over the knife at his belt. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, get back on his horse, and ride. The Apaches were known to be merciless. There were stories of settlers who wandered too close to their lands, of soldiers strung up from cottonwoods, of families burned, alive in their cabins. And here he was, a white rancher alone, stumbling upon what could only be some brutal punishment handed down by their people. If he cut them free, and someone saw. If he didn't, the storm would finish what the ropes had started. Damn it all, he muttered and drew his knife. The first sister stirred as the blade sliced through the rope at her wrists, eyes fluttering open. They were the color of river stones after rain, sharp, gray, and unblinking. She said nothing, but when the rope fell, she caught herself before collapsing, pride holding her upright where her strength faltered. The second sister, younger, though just as tall, was barely conscious. He cut her free and caught her, under the arms, lowering her gently to the sand. Up close, Matthew could see the welts across their backs, the cracked lips, the bruises dark as spilled ink along their ribs. Someone had beaten them. Someone had wanted them broken. The storm breaks. The first fat raindrop struck his cheek like a slap. Then another. Then the world turned to chaos. The storm came roaring over the ridge, a black wall of wind and water and sand. Lightning split the sky so close he smelled the iron tang of scorched air, and his horse screamed in terror, pulling at the reins until he tied them off to a half-buried boulder. He had no choice but to drag the women toward a shallow outcrop of rock at the creek's edge, half carrying the younger sister while the elder stumbled beside him, her jaw clenched in silent defiance. They huddled beneath the meager shelter as the sky fell around them. The rain came sideways, sheets of water mixed with grit so fine it got into his teeth. Thunder rolled across the plains like cannon fire. For long, breathless minutes there was nothing but survival, holding tight, keeping the sisters from slipping back into unconsciousness, praying the shelter wouldn't collapse under the fury of the wind. When the storm finally passed, the world was unrecognizable, a silence too heavy. The desert had turned to a strange, drowned wasteland, puddles of brown water collecting in every hollow, the earth trembling faintly from the storm's passing. Matthew wiped the grit from his face and tried to stand. His muscles screamed protest. The elder sister finally spoke, her voice low and rough as unpolished stone. Why? He blinked at her. Why what? Why cut us free? Matthew hesitated, his throat suddenly dry. Because you were dying. For a moment her gaze pierced him like a knife. Then she looked away, muttering something in Apache to her sister, who stirred weakly against the stone. He realized then that saving them might have sealed his fate. Shadows on the horizon. By the time the sky cleared, it was nearly nightfall. The last orange light stretched long across the wet plains, and far in the distance he saw them. Riders. At least a dozen, maybe more, silhouetted against the dying sun. Apache warriors. Matthew's gut twisted. He turned to the sisters, but neither spoke, neither moved. They just stared out at the approaching figures with the same stony silence, as if they'd been expecting this all along. When the riders reached the creek bed, one dismounted and stepped forward. He was taller than any man Matthew had ever seen, shoulders broad beneath the weight of a long beaded mantle, hair streaked with silver, eyes hard as hammered steel. The chief. He stopped in front of Matthew, gaze sweeping over the bound ropes. The freed sisters, the knife still clutched in Matthew's hand. Then he said something low in Apache, a command. The warriors spread out, circling Matthew like wolves around a cornered deer. And the chief spoke again, this time in broken, heavily accented English. You saved my daughters, Matthew swallowed, forcing himself to meet the man's gaze. I couldn't leave them. The chief studied him for a long, unbearable silence, then nodded once curtly. Tomorrow, he said, you come to our camp. He turned away before Matthew could respond. The warriors mounted their horses, taking the sisters with them. Within minutes they were gone, swallowed by the twilight. Matthew stood alone in the drowned creek bed, heart pounding, knowing one thing, with absolute certainty, tomorrow would change his life forever. The morning came slow and cold, dragging pale sunlight across the horizon as if the night itself refused to let go. The ranch was silent, too silent for Matthew Callahan's liking. Usually by this hour, the wind carried the distant bawl of cattle, the creak of windmills turning, the faint hum of life struggling against the endless western plains. But today, it was as though the land itself held its breath, waiting for what was to come. Matthew stood on the porch of his weather-beaten house, a chipped enamel cup clutched in his hand, steam rising off the bitter black coffee he hadn't touched. He hadn't slept. Not after last night. Not after the storm. Not after the Apache chief's words. Tomorrow, you come to our camp. Those words had burned into him like a brand, looping in his mind until they became louder than the wind itself. Haunted by choices, he'd saved the two women, Apache daughters, sisters. And now he couldn't decide if it had been an act of mercy or the single most foolish thing he'd ever done. The Apaches had a reputation, one carved into frontier stories whispered around saloon fires and passed down like warnings to children. There were tales of vengeance carried for generations, of debts repaid in blood rather than gratitude. He thought about the elder sister, proud, unyielding even when bound, her gray stone eyes flashing beneath the storm's fury. He thought about the younger one, too, the way her head had rested against his chest as he dragged her to shelter, her breath shallow, skin burning with fever. He'd risked his life to save them. And now, their people wanted him in their camp. Matthew stared out over the dry land that had once belonged to the Apaches, long before ranch fences and dusty homesteads carved it into pieces. The weight of history pressed heavy on him, a reminder that he was trespassing not just on land but on old wounds. Still, there was no choice. If he didn't go, they'd come for him, the long ride by noon. The sun hung like a pale coin in the washed-out sky, heat rippling off the plains in waves. Matthew saddled his horse, tightening the worn leather cinch with hands that trembled, despite his best efforts to steady them. The ride out toward Apache territory was quiet but tense, the silence stretching between him and the land. Every shifting shadow became a threat, every bird taking flight a warning. Somewhere out there, riders could already be watching him, arrows tipped and ready, testing his courage with unseen eyes. As he rode deeper into the desert, the hills began to rise around him, scattered with scrub and red stone, painting the landscape in warm ochres and dusty golds. There was beauty here, wild and unbroken, the kind of beauty that carried danger in its stillness. When he finally reached the edge of the Apache camp, he saw them, a half circle of hides stretched tight between poles, smoke curling lazily from fires, painted horses grazing nearby. Warriors stood like shadows against the sun, lean and sharp-eyed, hands resting casually on weapons that could end him before he blinked. The chief's gaze. They didn't speak when he approached. They didn't need to. Every step he took into that camp felt like walking into a trap, laid centuries before he'd been born. The chief stood at the center, taller and broader than the day before, his presence pulling the air taut. His mantle of beads and feathers shifted in the breeze, each decoration carrying meaning Matthew could only guess at. Victories, losses, ancestors, debts. Beside him stood the sisters. Freed from their bindings, cleaned of the dirt and blood, they were striking in a way that made Matthew's chest tighten. The elder sister's gaze met his with the same sharp, unyielding defiance he'd seen before. The younger, though pale and still recovering, offered him a faint, fleeting glance, softer but no less intense. The chief raised a hand, and silence fell over the camp. "You saved my blood," he said, his voice low, resonant, every syllable heavy with weight. "Among my people, life saved is debt carried. We repay always." Matthew exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't save them for payment." "No," the chief said, his expression unreadable. "But you will be repaid." The words settled over the camp like dust after a storm, and Matthew realized there was no kindness in the chief's tone, only inevitability. The forbidden spark as the discussion unfolded, Matthew found himself stealing glances at the younger sister. Her name, he learned, was Taya. The elder was named Naiche. They spoke little, but their presence filled the space around him. At one point, Taya caught his eye and held it, and for the briefest heartbeat, the noise of the camp faded. The crackle of fires, the stamping of horses, the murmurs of warriors. Her gaze carried something fragile, something unspoken. Gratitude, perhaps, or something more dangerous. That moment broke when Naiche stepped between them, her stare colder than any winter storm. Whatever connection had sparked, Naiche had snuffed it out with a single silent warning. A shocking demand. The chief turned back to Matthew, his voice deepening like distant thunder. "To repay, we give you choice," he said. "You take Taya, my younger daughter, as wife. You join our blood. Our people protect you. Your ranch becomes our ranch." Matthew's chest went cold. "And if I refuse?" The chief's gaze sharpened, the faintest curl of disdain at the corner of his mouth. "Then debt unpaid becomes insult. Insult brings war." The camp went silent, every eye fixed on him. He felt the weight of it all, the danger, the promise, the trap hidden beneath the gesture of alliance. To accept would bind him to a people he barely understood. To refuse would pit him against them. Before he could answer, a distant sound tore through the silence, the crack of a rifle, sharp and unmistakable. Warriors turned, shouts rising as riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes framed by dust and firelight. Outlaws. Matthew barely had time to draw his revolver before chaos swallowed the camp. The air cracked like dry timber as the first rifle shot echoed through the Apache camp. It was distant but unmistakable, the sharp, hollow sound of death carried on the wind. The murmurs around Matthew turned to shouts in an instant. Warriors scattered like wind-blown sparks, grabbing bows, rifles, and spears. Horses snorted and pawed the ground, sensing the panic before Matthew could even breathe. Matthew froze, his hand hovering over the worn grip of his revolver, heart pounding hard enough to drown out the noise. He didn't know where to look, didn't know which shadow might spit lead into his chest. And yet, somewhere beneath the panic, he understood this wasn't random. Whoever fired that shot knew exactly what they were doing. The Apache chief, his presence towering and unshakable even amidst chaos, stepped forward, his mantle of beads clattering softly against his chest. He barked commands in a low, clipped tone, his voice steady when everyone else seemed ready to break. Warriors obeyed without hesitation, forming lines, climbing ridges, scanning horizons. But Matthew saw something else. Beyond the fires, past the circle of hides and sharpened stakes, dark silhouettes were cresting a distant hill, blotting out the sinking sun behind them. At least 20 riders, maybe more. Wide-brimmed hats, rifles raised, their mounts kicking up dust that turned the golden evening light into a copper haze. Outlaws. The storm beneath his ribs, Matthew's breath came ragged, his hand finally settling on the worn walnut grip of his Colt. But one truth cut through the noise, sharp as barbed wire. He didn't belong here. These weren't his people. He didn't speak their language, didn't know their ways, didn't understand the deep bloodlines that bound them together. And yet if he ran, if he fled back to his lonely ranch and shuttered himself inside, the Apaches would remember. Debts written in blood. Taya. His eyes found her across the camp, her slight frame silhouetted against the shifting firelight, her hand resting on the haft of a spear almost as tall as she was. Her face was pale but steady, her mouth set in a hard, unbroken line. Beside her, Naiche, taller, stronger, unshakable, crouched low with a rifle cradled in her arms, scanning the distance with a predator's focus. When Taya glanced at him, just for a moment Matthew saw it. Fear. Not for herself but for him. That terrified him more than the outlaws, gunfire and thunder. The first volley came without warning, the distant riders unleashing a scream of bullets that tore through canvas. Hides and splintered wooden stakes. One warrior went down instantly, a hole opening in his chest where the life had been a heartbeat before. Chaos swallowed the camp whole. Horses screamed and reared. Smoke filled the air as fires overturned, and the scent of blood mixed with burning pine. Matthew dropped to a knee, instinct taking over where reason failed. He cocked the hammer of his Colt and returned fire, but the range was long, too long for a revolver. The Apache warriors fought like ghosts, slipping between shadows, firing from cover, vanishing before bullets could find them. But the outlaws were relentless, cutting a half circle around the camp, trying to pin them against the dry riverbed. Through the madness, Matthew felt a sudden weight crash into his side. Naiche grabbed his arm and yanked him down behind a fallen log, her breath hot against his ear. "You fight or you die," she said flatly, shoving a rifle into his hands. Matthew didn't argue. The outlaw leader. The gunfire slowed for a moment, just enough for voices to carry across the clearing. A rider appeared on a ridge, silhouetted against the fading sun, his coat flapping in the hot wind. He sat tall in the saddle, a broad-brimmed hat shadowing his face, but Matthew could see the grin. Cold, thin, practiced. "Callahan," the man bellowed, his voice rolling like distant thunder. "You picked the wrong friends, boy." Matthew's blood went cold. He knew that voice. Clem McGraw. Years ago, Clem had been nothing but a hired gun for one of the cattle barons east of the river, but he'd changed since then. Word in the saloon said he'd carved himself into something worse. An outlaw leader with a bounty so high even bounty hunters rode the other way when they heard his name. "Step aside, Matt," Clem called, spitting the words like venom. "We ain't here for you, we're here for them. Hand over the chief's brats and maybe we let you keep breathing." Matthew felt Naiche stiffen beside him, and when he looked at her, he saw murder in her eyes. He also saw the trap. Clem didn't come here for a fight. He came to provoke one, to spill Apache blood and start a war big enough to wipe them from the land entirely. The chief's decision, the Apache chief stood tall in the open, rifle slung but untouched. Warriors shouted warnings, begged him back to cover, but he raised one hand, silencing them all. He turned slowly, deliberately toward Matthew. "This fight," he said, his voice like gravel under wagon wheels, is now yours. Matthew blinked. Mine? You save my daughters. You take our debt. Fight with us, Callahan, or die with them. There was no anger in his tone, no plea. It was simple fact. Matthew understood then. Saving Taya and Nietzsche had bound him, to them in ways he hadn't foreseen. There was no undoing it. He drew a slow, steady breath, raised the rifle Nietzsche had handed him, and nodded once. Then we fight. Blood and fire. The outlaws charged, howling like devils, rifles blazing as their horses thundered down the ridge. The Apache warriors surged forward to meet them, war cries ripping through the air, arrows whistling past Matthew's ears like angry hornets. He fired, felt the kick against his shoulder, saw a rider tumble from his horse into the dust. Another bullet splintered the log beside his head, showering him with dirt and wood. He rolled, grabbed a fallen spear and drove it hard into the ground beside him to steady his aim. Beside him, Nietzsche moved like a force of nature, her rifle cracking rhythmically, every shot finding its mark. Taya, though weaker, stayed close, pulling arrows from a quiver and passing them to a young warrior with trembling hands. Then Matthew saw him. Clem McGraw, riding straight through the chaos, his revolver raised, eyes locked on the Apache chief. Matthew didn't think. He moved. Night draped itself over the desert like a burial shroud, the cool air thick with the metallic tang of spent gunpowder and blood. Smoke still clung to the edges of the Apache camp, twisting upward in thin, ghostly ribbons that caught the pale light of a rising moon. The battle had ended hours ago, but the echoes of violence hung heavy over the ground. Bodies had been carried away, fires rebuilt, wounds tended in silence. Matthew Callahan sat on a rough-hewn log near the outer edge of camp, his elbows braced against his knees, hands stained dark where they'd pressed against someone else's, torn flesh to stop the bleeding. The rifle lay across his lap, its barrel still warm as though reluctant to forget the heat of battle. His whole body ached from bruises and strain, but it was his thoughts that weighed most heavily. He'd killed. Today. Not just men. Not strangers. Clem McGraw, someone he'd known, someone who'd once been flesh and blood and laughter in a distant saloon. A man whose shadow Matthew thought he'd outrun. Now Clem lay buried somewhere beyond the ridges, and his death had set ripples into motion that Matthew could already feel tightening around his throat. Clem had ridden with powerful men. They wouldn't let his death go unanswered. The rancher had entered a fight that wasn't his, and the price for that was only beginning to be written. The weight of survival across the camp, the Apache chief, stood near the great fire, speaking in low tones to a cluster of warriors. His mantle of beads glimmered with the light of the flames, and his voice, deep and measured, carried the weight of a man who had seen death too many times to flinch from. And now beside him, Nietzsche stood tall, her rifle slung across her back, her expression hard as riverstone. Her presence was like a fortress, impenetrable, unmoving, a woman carved from the earth itself. The men respected her. Matthew could see it in the way their gazes drifted to her for reassurance when fear crept too close. And then there was Taya. She sat apart from the others near a small fire of her own, tending to the wounded with quiet hands and softer eyes. Though her skin was pale beneath the firelight, and her shoulders trembled from exhaustion, there was an unbroken strength in her movements, a grace born of resilience. Matthew watched her longer than he should have. At one point, she glanced up and caught him staring. Her gaze held his for a heartbeat, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. Gratitude, perhaps, but also something dangerous, something forbidden. Nietzsche noticed, too. When her sharp gray eyes cut toward him, Matthew looked away, quickly, his throat tightening with unspoken words. Lines drawn in blood later that night as the fires burned low and the wounded slept beneath hides. Matthew stood near the edge of camp, staring out at the dark horizon. His ranch was out there somewhere, 20 dying acres clinging to life beneath a choking drought. Once he'd thought of it as his whole world. Now, standing here, it felt impossibly small compared to what stretched before him. Nietzsche approached without a sound, her presence quiet but commanding. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms as the cool desert wind teased loose strands of her long black hair. "You should leave," she said flatly. Matthew turned to face her. "Leave? After what happened today, if I go back alone, they'll find me before I reach my ranch." "Maybe," she said, her tone sharp as flint. "But if you stay, you will bring death to us." He swallowed hard, feeling the truth of her words settle like stones in his gut. "I didn't ask for this," he said finally, voice low, almost pleading. Nietzsche's gaze softened, but only barely. "None of us did. Yet here we are." She paused, glancing briefly toward where her sister still knelt by the fire. "Taya, she looks at you differently. You need to understand what that means." Matthew's chest tightened, though he forced his expression to remain calm. "And what does it mean?" "It means danger," Nietzsche said. "For her. For you. For everyone." A fragile connection. The night deepened. Most of the camp slept, save for a few silent sentries who patrolled the edges like shadows under the stars. Matthew found himself restless, his thoughts circling endlessly until they brought him to the small fire where Taya sat alone. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable, but she didn't turn him away. "You should rest," she said softly, her voice little more than a breath carried on the wind. "Can't," he admitted, lowering himself beside her. "Too much in my head." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night, the rustle of leaves, the occasional, distant howl of a coyote, the quiet creak of leather as a sentry shifted on horseback nearby. Finally, Taya spoke again. "When you saved us," she said, her hands folded neatly in her lap, "I thought maybe you were foolish, maybe even reckless. And now?" She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the fire, its reflection dancing in her dark eyes. "Now I think, maybe you were brave. Or maybe you just don't know yet how much it will cost you." Matthew swallowed the lump in his throat. "Doesn't matter anymore. What's done is done." For a moment she reached out, fingertips brushing his hand, feather-light, tentative, fleeting, and then she pulled back quickly, as though burned. Nietzsche's warning rang in his ears, but his heart refused to listen. A shadow in the dark. Just before dawn, the sound came, a faint, distant whistle. It cut through the silence like a blade, low and haunting, rising and falling with an unnatural rhythm. Warriors stirred instantly, grabbing weapons, eyes scanning the ridges. Matthew felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as the whistle came again, closer this time, carried by the cold desert wind. From the shadows beyond the campfires, a figure emerged, a young Apache warrior staggering, his chest slick with blood, his breathing ragged and shallow. He collapsed before anyone could reach him, his final words barely a rasp. "More outlaws. 2 nights. 100 riders." The camp erupted, into chaos, but Matthew stood frozen, numb with dread. Clem McGraw's death had not ended anything. It had started something far worse. Betrayal among the fires later, as warriors prepared for the coming storm. Matthew overheard whispers carried on the night wind on rumors of a traitor within the tribe. Supplies stolen, messages leaked, someone feeding information to the outlaws. The chief's voice carried like thunder over the murmurs, summoning his people to council. Nietzsche stood at his side, her expression carved from stone, while Taya lingered behind her, eyes shadowed with worry. Matthew knew what this meant. If there was a traitor, the Apache would turn inward, tearing themselves apart just when they needed unity most. And he, an outsider bound by blood debt, would be caught in the middle. The coming reckoning. That night Matthew lay awake beneath a borrowed hide, staring up at the scatter of stars above. Somewhere out there, 100 riders were gathering. Hardened outlaws, bounty hunters, desperate men seeking revenge for Clem McGraw. Somewhere closer, someone inside this camp was working against them all. And somewhere even closer, just beyond his reach, Taya slept, her quiet breathing steady in the dark. Matthew closed his eyes, knowing sleep would never come. In 2 nights, the desert would burn, The sun bled into the horizon like a wound, painting the desert in shades of rust and dying fire. Heat waves shimmered over the cracked earth, carrying with them the scent of dust, smoke, and something older, the raw tension of men preparing for war. Matthew Callahan stood at the edge of the Apache camp, staring at the empty plains beyond, the ridges where shadows stretched long and thin, as though the earth itself held its breath. Somewhere out there, 100 riders waited, bounty hunters, hired guns, and broken men loyal to Clem McGraw even in death. He could almost feel them, crouched like wolves just beyond the tree line, licking their teeth, waiting for blood. Behind him, the camp murmured like a living thing. Children were moved to hidden shelters deep within the rocks. Warriors sharpened blades under fading light, their faces grim, painted with streaks of red clay that glimmered faintly in the glow of dying fires. Horses snorted nervously, tugging against reins as if they sensed the storm rolling closer. Everywhere Matthew looked, the air was thick with unspoken fear. And beneath that fear, something else coiled like a rattler in the grass. Distrust, the weight of whispers. Rumors slithered through the camp like smoke. The whispers of betrayal grew louder with every passing hour, curling into every conversation, every glance, until even the strongest warriors eyed one another like strangers. Supplies had gone missing again. A stack of arrows vanished from storage. A handful of rifles had disappeared in the night. And worst of all, the outlaws had found a hidden watering hole that only the Apache knew existed. Someone inside the camp was feeding them. At the council fire, tempers flared beneath the silent stars. The chief stood tall, his mantle of beads shifting softly in the breeze, his gaze calm but sharp. Nightshade stood beside him, her jaw tight, her rifle leaning against her shoulder like an extension of her body. Her voice when she spoke cut clean through the shouting. "Someone here carries outlaw blood," she said coldly, scanning the gathered faces. "And until we find them, none of us are safe." Matthew stood at the edge of the circle, feeling the weight of every stare. He didn't belong here. He wasn't Apache, wasn't bound by their oaths. And yet every set of eyes lingered on him just a moment too long, as if some of them wondered if this outsider had brought misfortune with him. He thought about speaking, about defending himself, but before he could, Taya's voice broke the silence. "It isn't him." Her words came soft but steady, and for a moment the camp fell quiet. Nightsh's head snapped toward her sister, gray eyes hardening like flint striking stone. "You speak for him now?" she asked. Taya didn't answer. She didn't need to. The way her gaze lingered on Matthew said enough. Forbidden fires. Later that night, long after the council fire had burned low, Matthew found himself wandering the edge of camp, drawn by a restlessness he couldn't shake. Sleep was impossible with war looming like a storm cloud. The distant ridges seemed to hum with anticipation, the desert itself caught between silence and violence. He found Taya sitting alone near a small spring at the camp's edge, the moonlight painting silver across the water's surface. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders, a dark cascade glinting in the soft light. "You shouldn't be out here," he said quietly, though his own voice betrayed the same exhaustion she carried. "Neither should you," she replied without looking at him. He lowered himself beside her, the cool earth damp beneath his palms. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them felt heavy, weighted with all the things they hadn't dared to say aloud. Finally, she turned to him, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Why did you stay, Matthew? You could have left. You could have run." Hesitated, searching for the right words. "I couldn't, not after saving you, not after—" He stopped himself before the rest could escape, but she heard it anyway. Taya's breath caught faintly, and for a moment, their worlds shrank to the space between them. Her hand brushed against his, tentative and fleeting, and he felt the warmth of her skin like a spark on dry tinder. But before that spark could catch, Nightsh's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Enough." She stood a few feet away, her silhouette framed by starlight, shoulders tense, her gray eyes colder than the moon above. "You think you know what you're doing?" she said quietly, dangerously. But you don't. You're tying her to a life that cannot exist. Our blood is not yours, Matthew Callahan. She is not yours. Taya's voice trembled as she rose to face her sister. And what if my heart is mine to give? Nietzsche didn't answer. She simply turned and walked away, her silence louder than any threat. Secrets in the blood. The next evening, the chief summoned Matthew to his lodge. The air inside was thick with sage smoke and shadow, the flicker of firelight casting long shapes across the hide walls. The chief sat cross-legged on a woven mat, his expression carved from stone. "You must know something," he said without preamble. "About my daughters." Matthew frowned, unsure what trap he was stepping into. "What about them?" The chief's gaze burned through him. "They are not like the others. Their mother was not Apache." The words struck Matthew like a hammer blow. "Their blood is mixed," the chief continued, his tone steady but heavy. "Half white, half ours. Many among my people do not accept them. It is why they were tied to that wheel when you found them. Punishment not just for what they did, but for what they are." Matthew sat in stunned silence, the truth unraveling threads he hadn't even known were there. The whispers, the stares, the coldness some warriors carried toward the sisters. It all made sense now. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. The chief leaned forward, his voice low, almost a growl. "Because if you choose Taya, you choose war not just with the outlaws, but with my people. Half will follow me, half will turn against us. Her blood is already a wound. Your love will make it deeper." Matthew swallowed hard, feeling the trap closing around him. Every path he saw led to blood, the traitor revealed. Before Matthew could respond, shouts erupted outside. Warriors ran past the lodge, their voices sharp, angry, urgent. He and the chief stepped out into the firelight, where a circle had formed around a young Apache man held to the ground, his face bruised, his mouth bloodied. Nietzsche stood over him, rifle in hand, her expression thunderous. "He carries outlaw. Coin," she spat, throwing a leather pouch into the dust where silver spilled in the firelight. "He's been feeding them our secrets." The camp roared with fury, but the chief silenced them with a raised hand. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and terrible. "Bind him," he said. "Tomorrow we make an example." But as the traitor was dragged away, Matthew caught the man's eyes. Wild, defiant, burning with something beyond fear. "You're all dead," the man hissed. "Before the next sun falls, they'll burn this camp to the ground." The gathering storm that night. Matthew climbed a low ridge at the camp's edge and stared into the horizon. In the distance, faint torches flickered like dying stars scattered across the plains. The outlaw army had arrived. Beneath him, the camp braced itself, preparing for a battle that felt less like survival and more like judgment. Behind him, Taya appeared silently, her presence soft as moonlight. She stood close but didn't speak, and in the fragile quiet, Matthew finally understood. Whatever tomorrow brought, victory, death, redemption, their fates were bound together now, written in a language older than blood and fire. Far away, the howl of a lone coyote broke the silence, carrying across the night like a warning from the gods themselves. Tomorrow, the desert would drown in blood. Dawn bled slowly over the desert, painting the horizon in muted shades of red and gold, the color of fire, of warning of death yet to come. The silence was unnatural, heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Matthew Callahan stood on the ridge above the Apache camp, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his boots planted in the dry, crumbling earth. His eyes scanned the wide expanse beyond the hills, where faint tendrils of dust curled upward into the morning light like smoke from an unseen fire. They were out there, somewhere beyond the ridges and gullies. Clem McGraw's riders, 100 men, maybe more when we're gathering. Hardened killers, bounty hunters, and desperate souls drawn together by the promise of gold and blood. Clem's death had bound them tighter than loyalty ever could. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about extermination. Behind him, The Apache camp stirred with quiet urgency. Warriors painted their faces with streaks of red and black clay, each line a prayer to ancestors, each mark a promise to the dead. Women tied braids into their children's hair and whispered blessings they prayed would not be their last. The smell of sage smoke drifted on the wind, mixing with the sharp tang of oiled steel and freshly tanned leather. It would happen today. The desert knew it, and so did Matthew. Shadows before the fire. Night approached without a sound, her presence, like a storm, held barely in check. Her rifle rested against her shoulder, her long black hair bound tightly behind her, and her gray eyes were cold as river stones under ice. "They come soon," she said simply. Matthew nodded, his jaw tight. "I know." For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with all the things neither dared say. They were bound now, not by choice but by circumstance, by blood spilled on the same ground, by debts neither could escape. Naisha studied him for a long moment before speaking. Again her voice low, clipped. "Taya trusts you," she said, each word heavy, deliberate. "Don't give her a reason to regret it." Matthew met her gaze. "I won't." Naisha said nothing more. She turned and walked back toward the camp, her posture rigid, every step radiating controlled fury and pride. He watched her go, understanding that her strength was the only thing keeping half the tribe from splintering apart. If she faltered, if she broke, they would all fall with her. Taya's quiet courage. As the camp prepared for battle, Matthew found Taya tending to the wounded beneath the shade of a canvas hide. Her hands moved deftly, wrapping cloth around a young warrior's bleeding arm, her expression serene despite the fear that clung to the air like dust before a storm. She looked up when he approached, her dark eyes soft but steady. "You shouldn't be here," she said gently. "You should be at the front with the others. I wanted to see you first," Matthew admitted, his voice low, meant only for her. Something in her gaze flickered. Surprise, perhaps. Or something deeper, something she dared not name. She looked away quickly, focusing on tying the bandage. With trembling hands, "If you stay close to me," she whispered, "you'll die." Matthew knelt beside her, lowering his voice until it was almost a breath. "Then I'll die knowing why I stayed." Her hands stilled, and for a moment, the noise of the camp faded into silence. Then slowly, she reached out, letting her fingers brush his, hesitant, fleeting, like touching fire and knowing it would burn. Neither spoke after that. There was nothing left to say. The battle begins. The first shot cracked across the desert, like a whip, sharp and distant. Every warrior froze, every breath caught in a single suspended moment. Then the second shot came, closer this time, and the horizon erupted with dust as the outlaw army thundered into view. A dark wave of riders cresting the ridges under a sun that seemed to burn hotter with each passing second. The Apache warriors surged forward with a roar that shook the ground, arrows whistling, rifles cracking, war cries tearing through the rising chaos. The two forces collided like a storm meeting dry earth, sudden, violent, absolute. Matthew fought from the ridgeline alongside Naiche and a handful of warriors, his rifle kicking hard against his shoulder with every shot. He fired until his hands bled, until his lungs burned with smoke and dust, until the cries of men and horses drowned out thought itself. Below, the outlaws pressed hard, their numbers relentless, their anger boiling hotter than the desert sun. Through the chaos, Matthew's gaze found Taya. She moved among the wounded, pulling men from the line of fire, pressing hands against bleeding wounds, her face streaked with dirt and sweat but unshaken. And then he saw the glint of steel, a rider breaking through the Apache line, a long knife raised, charging straight toward her. Matthew didn't think. He dropped his rifle, tore down the ridge, and slammed into the rider with everything he had. The two men hit the earth in a tangle of fists and fury, sand grinding into skin as knives flashed in the burning light. Betrayal's knife as Matthew struggled with the rider. A shout rose from somewhere behind him. He turned in time to see an Apache warrior, one of their own, swinging his rifle toward the chief's back. The traitor. Nietzsche saw it too. She moved like lightning, slamming into the man before he could fire, the two of them crashing into the dust in a violent struggle. The traitor snarled, spitting curses, his knife flashing in the sun, but Nietzsche was faster. She drove her blade home with a roar, and the man went still beneath her. She stood, breathless, streaked with his blood, and turned just in time to see a fresh wave of outlaws cresting the southern ridge. "They're flanking us," she shouted, her voice carrying above the chaos. But it was already too late. Ashes and new dawns. The battle raged for hours, the sun crawling slowly overhead as the desert drank greedily from the dead. Matthew lost track of time, of how many bullets he'd fired, of how many bodies lay scattered in the sand. By the time the last rider fell, the Apache camp was unrecognizable. Smoke rising from burned hides, blood darkening the earth. The silence broken only by the low, ragged groans of the wounded. Matthew staggered to his feet, chest heaving, rifle hanging uselessly at his side. He searched the wreckage desperately until he saw her. Taya, kneeling beside a fallen warrior, her hands red to the wrists, her face pale and streaked with tears she hadn't noticed. She looked up at him, and for a moment, they simply stared. Across the chaos, two souls caught in the quiet between storms. The Apache had won, but it didn't feel like victory. The chief stood at the center of the camp, his mantle torn, his face carved from stone. His gaze swept the battlefield, then fell on Matthew. Slowly, he nodded once. "Debt paid," he said simply. Matthew should have felt relief. Instead, all he felt was hollow. A fragile peace. That night, the survivors gathered around what remained of the great fire. Songs were sung, prayers whispered to ancestors, but the celebration was muted, the weight of loss pressing down like the heavy desert air before rain. Matthew sat apart from the others, his hands still raw, his body aching, his mind restless. Taya found him there beneath the stars, her steps soft, her shadow long against the pale earth. She lowered herself beside him without a word, her shoulder brushing his. For a long time, neither spoke. There were no promises, no confessions, no talk of what tomorrow might bring. There was only the fragile silence between them, full of things they both felt but could not name. Finally, Taya reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, grounding him in the moment. "You'll leave soon," she said quietly. Matthew hesitated, staring out at the dark ridges. "Maybe." She nodded once, as though she'd already known. Then softly she whispered, "But wherever you go, you carry me with you." He squeezed her hand gently, saying nothing. There were no words big enough for what they'd endured. Above them, the stars burned bright and cold, uncaring and eternal. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the wind carried the scent of rain. The end.